Kingsfield, a 1994 dungeon crawler released only in Japan that has the player navigate 5 floors of horizontal terrain. An excellent, albeit primitive title that kicked off the series, and FromSoftware as a development studio. Kingsfield 2, a tighter, vertically stacked world that introduced a more seamless, Metroid-like environment to explore. Confusing at times, but still great. The third entry released in quick succession and brought the Verticality trilogy to a satisfying conclusion. Sprawling, ambitious open terrain accented with intricately designed interiors, marrying the best qualities of its predecessors into one seamless package. We've covered them all on this channel. In between those and this, the company released a few games in a similar style, which I'll eventually cover in the future. The Ancient City, a standalone 2001 PS2 entry set in a different kingdom, the only narrative carryover being the overall sense of destruction and decay. It plays similarly to the classic Verticality trilogy, only slower, if you can believe that. This one feels more like an amalgamation of all first-person fantasy titles developed by the company. The horror elements of Shadow Tower blended with the fantasy bits from Eternal Ring, dressed in familiar Kingsfield garb. The Ancient City is one of the most engrossing, addictive, beautifully immersive games I've ever played. It's up there on my list of best of all time, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Perhaps we'd better start at the beginning.
The cursed land lies deep in a dense, colorless forest. Hidden within this land is an ancient city, once known to the forest folk as the Holy Land. Buried in the depths of the city, a warning was discovered long after the rulers have fallen. Grave misfortune will befall those who behold the idol that stares into the darkness. The idol, taken from the ancient land, led the kingdom down a path of destruction. The idol must be returned. Under a dark and cloudy sky, the Swordmaster led his men to the ancient land. The cursed land swallowed the soldiers, and all that remained was dark silence.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds like the narrator from the ending of the Verticality trilogy is back with all of his gravitas. The land of Helidon greets the player with an almost unavoidable trap baited by a health replenishing item straight out of the gate. It's immediately apparent that FromSoft aren't fooling around, but I question the fairness of this hazard. Previous titles in the series did similar things, specifically Kingsfield 2. That adventure began on the hazardous shore of Melanot, surrounded by water. It taught the player to be cautious in a realistic, sensible way. These games are visually dark and hard to see, but it was clear that there was a drop-off. Here, in this fourth outing, it feels like the studio was honoring their reputation, or simply having a laugh at the player's expense. Visually, there's not a lot to go on. The ground is barely different and simply doesn't look treacherous or lethal in the slightest. Initially, I probably would have argued that it is teaching the player to be mindful of their surroundings, that traps can exist anywhere, and as true as this is, it's not conveyed well enough and comes off as a cheap gag. What's worse is that those who fall victim to this illogically poorly conceived death pit will have to endure a game over that sets them back to the title screen. A waste of time, a bad first impression that doesn't do the game justice. It's infrequent that the Ancient City plays dirty. It's filled with traps, sure, but most are spelled out, at least in future areas. Fortunately, this misguided trick is the exception. This final Kingsfield is one of the tightest, best designed video games I've ever played, despite this rocky moment, and one of FromSoftware's crowning achievements as far as I'm concerned. It's exquisite. The controls are still a bit clunky, but those who have played other titles by this team will likely default to the tried and true D-pad to get around. This time the 2 analog sticks are involved, but I simply couldn't find a configuration that worked for me. The option is there to swap things around, so maybe you'll find a more comfortable way of playing that doesn't make your D-pad thumb scream for mercy. During this era, very few first-person console games had locked in that standard movement and camera control we've become accustomed to today. So I just tend to go old school with it. The triggers to tilt, the bumpers to strafe. A quick use item can be assigned to the select button, something that should be used exclusively for health replenishing herbs, potions, or spells, as enemies hit hard and patching up quickly on the go is almost imperative. This slot can be filled with anything, but I'd be surprised if anyone uses it for anything else. Stamina and mana management is as important as ever. When the bars at the top are at full capacity, melee weapons hit harder, giving the combat a satisfying rhythmic quality. Offensive spells can only be cast when the bottom bar is maxed out, and the crescent meter next to the life orb in the HUD drains with each use. At first, I preferred the numerical style system present in the older games, but it didn't take me long to appreciate how tidily efficient this new display is. It's easy to read and concisely shows all information without taking up too much screen real estate. An oxygen meter is even incorporated, only filling itself up when necessary, while navigating one of this game's many underwater regions. Zero unnecessary clutter, even when inflicted by any of the billions of status ailments. There's no hand-holding here, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Everything scales organically with use. Bashing enemies with one of the many melee weapons increases power, making the meter replenish quicker. Leveling up projectile magic works the same. There are so many spells to learn by collecting elemental crystals throughout the world, but I mostly stick to the trusty Fireball and Wind Cutter for ranged combat, meaning those are the two that become the most powerful throughout my playthroughs. There are tons of variations to play around with. Most are hidden quite well and are entirely optional. Fire is mandatory as it allows access to an early game point of progression, but the majority are more experimental, giving the participant complete control of how they'd like to deck out their character. Earth Heal is another necessary pickup that is tough to avoid and crucial to level up, as the game eventually ceases to dole out finite health replenishing items before too long. Player growth is masterfully exhibited. At first, Devian barely has enough stamina to tie his shoes before getting winded. Enemies hit hard and status effects are a death sentence. If we're going to compare this to a modern FromSoft title, I'd liken it to Dark Souls 2 in how punishingly off-putting everything is from the outset, but more on that later. There's freedom to the exploration, but eventually it'll be necessary to plunge into a poison-filled cave system to progress early on. It's not easy, and will definitely separate the mice from the men, but this is the type of gating that appeals to me. Many will give up right here, and I can't say I blame them. The game is asking a lot, but those who persevere will be rewarded with one of the best adventure games on the hardware. I appreciate how FromSoftware put this area so close to the beginning. They didn't compromise their vision, but still showcased everything the game is early enough to not waste a player's time. You're either on board or you're not. If the slow turning speed didn't scare you off, this deep dive into the poison mines might. If you stuck with it, the rewards make the following few areas much more palatable. Puzzles, combat, mana use, it's all drip-fed intrinsically through gameplay. What follows are a series of clever puzzles that force the participant to think outside the box. It's this attention to detail that I think makes the Ancient City an addictive, underappreciated classic. Honestly, I can't think of a first-person action-adventure title that does it better. It never throws too much at a newcomer, yet remains engaging for anyone who is interested in getting acclimated with its idiosyncrasies. Shortcuts reveal themselves to astute players. As soon as I was low on resources and began to panic, I'd almost always find a new, clever path back to the vendor at the beginning. Retracing one's steps is an easier option since most enemies stay dead, but bravery is rewarded. The first quarter of the adventure will have you reusing the same Cthulhu-carved save statues and revisiting one of the first NPCs is for healing grass. Once the game is convinced it can throw more at you, it sends you further from these familiar regions, but offers a few crystal flasks along with a handy mana pool to replenish them. This is where the gloves come off. No longer will single-use healing items be as plentiful. Instead, it forces the player to rely on magic, almost exclusively to replenish most ailments. This is also where a variation of the warping system returns, making it easier to access this magical pond from any of the branching routes. It's satisfying because you are naturally learning how to do these things with very little unmediated guidance. Everything is horrible in Halidon, but you are slowly peeling the layers back in real time to discover what is at the heart of this mystery. At my age, I find it increasingly more difficult to get invested in games that interrupt my actions to dump story bits or tutorials at every turn. They pull me out. King's Field has never been a success in the West. Many critics unfairly pitted the first entries up against Doom, complaining about the sluggish movement speed and deliberate combat. It was a different time, but I don't think that excuses these so-called professional reviewers for being so narrow-minded, especially when games like Ultima Underworld existed. I'm not complaining about someone not sharing the same amount of enjoyment that I do from these games. That's juvenile and kind of a pet peeve of mine on its own, especially nowadays when a dissenting opinion about a work of art online will bring out the most pathetic responses from lowlifes. What bothers me is the comparison. It's apples and oranges. I have an unhealthy obsession with Doom. It, Quake, and Return to Castle Wolfenstein have been installed on every computer I've owned. They're my comfort food. King's Field is an entirely different beast though. These are the games I play when I have a full day to myself. There's something therapeutic about the pace, style, and music in all four of these titles that grabs me. They're tough to put down, and I think all of that has to do with their desire to not interrupt me with meaninglessness. In a lot of ways, this fourth entry does it the best. A refinement of the formula. Some of the edges have been sanded down, experiments that didn't work so well in the Verdite trilogy ironed out or entirely abandoned. Things like warping around are easier to understand, elemental crystals less cumbersome to pop and add to the inventory. I still have a soft spot for the third entry, but would definitely recommend the Ancient City to newcomers for its polish. It's an acquired taste, but there's something about these earlier polygonal visuals that really appeal to me, especially in the realm of fantasy horror. Nothing creeps me out more than rudimentary shapes peering from the darkness. Many enemies return from the PlayStation 1 series, only now they've been given a ghastly new makeover. Wandering into the backyard from this dilapidated cabin, only to be greeted by this familiar foe left a lasting impression. I imagine a world where the family who once lived here peered out one overcast morning, gazed upon this abomination, and just noped out. It's all yours now, Stumpy. The house, the backyard, we're out. Or how about this sad Cliff Clavin looking son of a bitch, seeking refuge from all of Halidon's horrors. Have a bit of a chit chat with him, eliminate the monsters that are giving him a tough time. Now, just watch these birds. No tacky sound scares, extraneous dialogue dumps, or forced camera angles. If I didn't listen and look up on my own, I'd have missed the lead up. Brilliant design in an interactive medium. It sounds a bit obvious to make that point, but I was starting to lose interest in games during this period as many were attempting to emulate cinematic storytelling. I'll watch a movie if that's what I'm in the mood for. I'd rather not sit through long periods of tremendously outdated CG story elements in between brief, linear bouts of curated action. Thank you very much. The Ancient City has aged gracefully in my eyes, mostly because it never imposes pre-rendered or in-engine cutscenes to drive the narrative. The gameplay is bookended by some story bits, but everything else happens while you're playing. Events change, story arcs can be manipulated due to some relatively minor involvement, and there are a few branching paths to reward curious participants. Entire sections can be skipped. Plenty of obstacles can be circumvented with some ingenuity. There's a clear path path of progression, but very few strict roadblocks from beginning to end. Of course, things are meant to be done in a specific order, so I'm not sure if all these side routes were intentional, but either way, it's a treat. Things just keep evolving. New enemies are introduced until the very end, puzzles continue to impress as the environments change, icy ruins turn to fire, revealing trinkets after a couple of specific events. One of the many things Dark Souls 2 would eventually borrow over a decade later in its Ivory King DLC. Typically, I prefer not to compare older games with newer ones, but I'll likely never cover the Souls series on this channel. I just find it fascinating how similar that middle chapter is to Kingsfield 4. I've already mentioned the steeper difficulty out of the gate due to how weak and slow the characters start out as, but something that is less quantifiable is how that affects gameplay. Dark Souls 2 feels sluggish and unforgiving in its earliest moments. Stamina regeneration, Estus chugging, and iframes tied to the addition of an adaptability stat make it the toughest in the trilogy at the start. The difficulty slope is similar to the ancient city as the player gradually levels up. The environments also have a hazy, dreamlike quality to them. Of course, when it comes to the world layout, Helidon is superior in every way due to its perfectly executed interconnected design, but many regions in Dark Souls 2 look remarkably similar. Its DLC and Scholar of the First Sin update include more puzzles with a heavier emphasis on verticality. Lockstones are present in each, a lot of enemies are shared between the two, switches are similar in design. Opens a pathway, do, Bell Summoner awakens the dead in a crypt, a very Huntsman's Copse No Man's Wharf shortcut bridge to be kicked down, though this, as well as the existence of gigantic pillbugs, are more demon souls than anything. Overall, Dark Souls 2 feels more like a spiritual successor to the Kingsfield series or an homage to FromSoftware as a whole, rather than a true sequel. It has really grown on me over the years despite its bland, oftentimes uninspired visuals, piss-poor sense of interconnectivity, and underwhelming boss battles. All of these things worked for Kingsfield due to the hardware restrictions, and the first-person perspective definitely helps to make everything feel more immediately immersive. The way it all connects is, again, its most impressive quality. The titular city, an ascending Escher painting in full 3D brought to life by its uneasy, vertical splendor with a soul safe spot carved into its central tower. All of the mid-game regions splayed from its connecting, unlockable bridges like tendrils reaching out from a stationary body. Almost everything takes place within claustrophobic, oftentimes terrifying interiors, making the rare regions that take place outdoors more impactful. There's an intriguing sense of space and scale, particularly in this moment where we continue to ascend stairs after grueling it out in pitch black caves, only to be greeted by this heavenly vista. There are a lot of dark, dank dungeons, but there's also beauty to be found in Helidon. From the icy caverns to the Atlantis-style sunken city, there's always something new to behold. The skyboxes look fantastic in the few, brief regions where they can be admired. The performance could be better, but it's impressive that the entire world seemingly loads in one chunk. Those who suffer from motion sickness may have a tough time adjusting to the frame rate. Personally, it doesn't bother me, but my partner started to feel a bit nauseous after a few moments, which is a shame since she's a big fan of these types of games as well. There's an option to turn off the realistic walking animation, but it didn't help as it seems more relegated to the unnatural, exaggerated screen bobbing that occurs on staircases. The options in general are relatively robust compared to other FromSoft titles from this era. It's also nice that the journal returns from Kingsfield 3, where interactions with NPCs can be tracked. The sex compass no longer exists, but isn't all that necessary as there are enough landmarks and environmental differences to signpost players. Enemies rarely respawn outside of a few that were clearly designed to offer a guide. For instance, there will always be a poison plant in this crypt to let the player know they are on the correct path to a new area. Maps are far less useful as well. Rarely do I waste my hard-earned cash on them. When one is required, it'll be offered up for free. The best example of this is here, in these watery caves. An enemy drops one as part of a puzzle clue. Referring to it shows where a few items lie in order to reach the next area. Now, I'm not going to spoil the solution, but it's these experimental sequences that contribute to my opinion that The Ancient City is one of the best adventure games of all time. It forces the participant to think outside the box without resorting to repetitiveness. Around each corner, beyond the walls, chances to discover unique secrets. Here in this castle, for instance, an enormous amount of optional rooms, as well as an opportunity to tackle a late-game gauntlet of bosses before it's time. And there's this room. When I first encountered it, I took one look and noped out like a coward. It was the 237 of The Ancient City for me, so I pissed around, clearing everything else out, increased my real-life courage stats to max, and cautiously entered after a bit of liquid courage, only to find nothing but a single, solitary stone pillar in the center. Now, check this out. The hazy reflections on the floor make you look up to find these gruesome decayed statues seemingly vomiting all sorts of benign malevolence into this room, a cancerous infection of rot and disease infesting this entire godforsaken place. It takes a lot to get under my skin. Video games and movies rarely make me feel this uneasy, but a well-written novel certainly does. The difference is clear. Reading puts the onus on the reader. To my knowledge, there's no explanation for this room. It's a mystery for my imagination to parse. Here's another. Clearly, these eyes have something to do with this Temple of Doom trap, but it took me a bit of investigating to suss it out. It's unsettling without the need to be manipulative or obnoxious. Zero sound scares, nary a monster to be found. The atmosphere, the visuals, the abstract, it's Lovecraftian in design. The unknown. And that's just a taste of what you can expect to see. Mid-game areas. Let's keep it clean with as few spoilers as possible because all of you FromSoft fans owe it to yourselves to give this game a whirl. It's a real roller coaster ride, all right. Oh no. Well, there's always emulation. Combat just kinda is what it is. Personally, I find it engaging and rather hypnotic, but as I've stated, it won't be everyone's cup of tea. Circle strafing isn't as viable an option as it was in previous titles due to the better enemy AI and slower movement speed, but that's a good thing, as it encourages a cleverer approach. The reworked magic system also makes it tougher to pin an opponent down, since it takes a bit longer to fill the meter between projectiles. The Ancient City makes up for this with its sheer amount of enemy variety. Of course, we've got skeletons and blobs. These giant guardians are interesting. They are tied to crowns, leading to some clever puzzles. I particularly like how the developers show this fallen one with arrows in its head as an in-world clue. Poison-spewing zombies, infected soldiers with a neat twist. This guy doesn't feel too well, return, and he goes rotten. When defeated, parasitic conspiracy creatures scurry from their corpses. Unsettling. If you're able to kill one of these quick-moving bugs, you'll gain extra experience points, but they're slippery, so eliminating them is nearly impossible. Nope. Gotcha, sucker. As things progress, baddies get more aggressive. This cave full of furry feral mole vermin can go straight to hell. These Dark Souls 1 serpent archers are also a nuisance as they inflict a paralyzing status effect on our hero, making it impossible to move. Frustrating. All of the character designs are well detailed. At times a bit goofy, but the majority genuinely terrified me. Especially when they get right up in your grill. When properly aligned, they'll also hit each other with projectiles, which is always a nice touch. Twisted Zora creatures, serpents, Pepsi Man! I'd be here all day if I talked about each and every enemy, so let me just say it again. There are plenty, and new ones get introduced right until the very end. Bosses aren't that special despite how cool some of them look. There's very little finesse required to take them out, which is a bit of a shame as a few have interesting patterns. Conceptually, I could see what they were going for, but ultimately they dissolve into messy spam fests, relying more on preparation than skill. Way too many of them can be cheesed or manipulated, which make them feel like an afterthought, unfortunately. Still, these games have always been about exploration rather than combat, and these are the best we've seen in the series, even if that's not saying much. I do like how they're spread out though. It's not as predictable as most games. The first appears pretty early on, but you'll have to travel quite far to reach the second. Some areas have multiple boss encounters, while others have none, so I was always caught off guard. One of my longest gripes regarding the Verticality trilogy was how keys were managed. For every treasure chest and door, one had to cycle through their bloated inventory, manually testing each of them until a proper fit was found. Thankfully, finally, this entire system has been completely reworked. Not only are keys regulated to their own item screen, but now they automatically unlock things without having to visit the menus. Beautiful. Better late than never. Trinkets, weapons, and gear are visible on our playable protagonist. My dude rarely wears pants. Two-handed weapons, daggers, swords. This time around, barrels now need to be busted open to collect their secrets, but only heavier melee tools can achieve this. A trusty pickaxe is perfect for busting down barriers. Fire magic dissolves spiderwebs, and so on. Bolts and arrows are more powerful than ever, and can be used to cheese a wide variety of enemies, as well as bosses. Rubbing up against walls while tapping the action button reveals hidden pathways, but these are much rarer, so you shouldn't need to hump every surface in existence, unless you want to. I'm not here to shame. These secrets are spelled out better than ever. The sound design is terrific, so you'll always hear creatures bustling around behind what appears to be a solid surface. Other areas can be seen through windows or cracks, telltale environmental clues that something lies within. Unfortunately, seeing items on the ground and picking them up is a huge hassle. Certain textures blend with goodies, making them tricky to parse, and some are tucked away. There are so many tombstones that hide goodies, and you'll need to be in the exact right space for your slow adventurer to nab them. Placing lock keys into pedestals or walls is needlessly cumbersome at times as well, due to how finicky this is. Weapon degradation has been introduced, but I've never had anything break. The blacksmith returns from Kingsfield 3, a crestfallen warrior greets you at the beginning of the adventure, and I'd like to take the time to acknowledge how brief the dialogue is. This first vendor, who doesn't have the courage to turn and face my magnificence, has a lot of shit going on. His story develops, but he concisely states what's up without prattling on. I miss this simplicity. There's nothing worse than a merchant who recycles the same chunks of dialogue. Revisiting them is required in most games, and having to read or hear the same story over and over and over is one of my biggest pet peeves, so props to these developers for keeping things brief. Eventually, you'll stumble upon wandering item dealers. This dude came straight from the early aughts. He likes growly Nickelback vocals and Sublime quite a bit. All of them are deliberately placed in thoughtful areas that are easy to warp to. Backtracking is rarely an issue if you have a vague idea where to go next, and the fast travel system is more streamlined than previous entries. It's as simple as placing a colored stone into a statue and using the matching red, blue, green, or yellow wand to quickly warp back. The load times are almost non-existent, making it super swift to travel between locations. Tsukasa Saito's soundtrack ties everything together. It's phenomenal. Kingsfield series has always featured some of the best music in the industry. The Ancient City is no exception. It's also nice to hear this version of Knives Out by Radiohead. heavy emphasis on synth keys here that give every track a distinct video game sound. Tsukasa continues to work for the company to this day, but I'll always have a soft spot for this collection of tunes. I'll gladly opt for this creative atmospheric soundtrack over most modern movie-like orchestral works simply because it's uniquely specific to this medium. Every contributing element makes for an incredibly focused package. This is From Software's first-person magnum opus. They were simply firing on all cylinders here, and the attention to detail is impossible to ignore. It's clear that they put their all into this final Kingsfield title, and it kinda makes me sad. I held off on reviewing this one because I just didn't want to see it come to an end. So there you have it. Another video for another 100 people to watch. Next time on this channel, something completely different to tank my views even more, so stay tuned.
Alright, they're warm and soft. And when they wash their cars, they're dressed in nothing but suds, a suntan, and a cowboy hat.